Good afternoon, Fred. You're muted.
Oh, there we go. Hey, man.
How's your day going?
Day's going well. Day's going well. Sessions were good, man.
Yeah, they were. We had about 15 viewers
Yeah.
but already the sessions from last night have doubled, about 30. And I know we have one watching from the Philippines and another person watching from Australia.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Hey, are you going to make the sessions available in a video format that's not live stream? Because the live stream loops and loops and loops. Are you going to make it available at all?
Yes.
Okay. So it'll be the uploaded version that's not jumpy, right?
I hope so.
Okay. Well, I mean, if not, I have mine.
Right.
Obviously on Vimeo, he can re-download and just add the banner and then just re-upload to y'all's YouTube site as a standalone video. You can do the same with John Marks.
Right. Yeah. By the way, this is being recorded.
Yeah.
FYI. What I plan to do is, I don't know what they call it, it's not a separate channel, but a separate series in our YouTube channel, and line all the videos up, including these Zoom sessions one by one.
That's cool. No, that's cool, man. Yeah, I mean, live stream is what it is. I feel like all in all, it's gone well. It's just there is so much that's out of your control.
Right.
You know?
Well, if we're live streaming, speaking live, then the problem sometimes it freezing is
right.
The video are exporting faster than the live stream can import.
No, right. We had the same problem. We were uploading videos and then live streaming them, and it would do it was far worse than what's going on with yours. Yours has been good, in my opinion. Ours was really jumpy and would freeze. And so finally we just stopped live streaming the videos and just started making them available at a certain time.
Yeah. I see.
Technology is a catch-22, man, especially when you have so many factors beyond your control with the internet.
Right.
Y'all have done a great job, Rex, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. It's, always stressful getting, organized, but,
sure.
Firstly, it's been encouraging, challenging, to go back to my notes, I knew hospitality was an important part of the gospel. I just didn't realize how integral it is to the gospel, to the point where, without it, there's just a failure to embody the gospel.
Agreed. That's why I said it's central. I think it's central to the gospel. I think it's central to Paul's gospel. And I think it's central to gospel. I think it should, in that paper I wrote that got published by Missio Dei Journal, the statement that churches must recapture hospitality as a central ecclesial posture. I think it needs to be not an organizing principle, because I think Christology and missiology is an organizing principle, but I certainly think it needs to be a central piece to ecclesial postures.
In my D-Min, I argued that our God, our witness is always centered Christologically and oriented eschatologically. And so that it's coherent with the very life that Jesus lived. And is a reflection not of old creation, but of new creation.
Mm-hmm.
That when people want to know what it's going to be like in heaven, as we would say, some people would say, they ought to be able to look at the church and begin to get a glimpse. That's the poemas in Ephesians 2:10, God's handiwork, workmanship, which the New Jerusalem Bible translates, we are God's work of art. And I tell people, welcome, Weldon. I tell people, if you go piece of art, it's be put on display, and if you watch a person painting a picture, when they start out, you have no idea, but when they're 70-80% finished, you can begin to get a glimpse and anticipate of what they're painting and anticipate what the finished product is going to be, and that ought to be the church. But we've got some people joining in now, so John Delp and I went and had Mexican food for lunch. And so I'll be honest, after lunch, there was a part of me saying, where's the lazy boy chair?
I can appreciate that. Hey, tell John that he's done a great job with everything when you see him, if you don't mind.
I will.
I think he really has done a great job.
Yeah, very helpful because he's the one that understands all the technology.
Yeah, he's done a great job.
John's running out to get me another cup of coffee right now.
Is he? It's kind of him.
What's your wife and child doing today?
Ian's enjoying a home day with nothing to do, and Allison's out running some errands. I told him to pretend like I'm not here this weekend, because technically I wouldn't have been here this weekend.
I don't know what my family's doing today.
Yeah, y'all enjoying the new house?
We are. Very much.
I'm glad. Tell me about that new guitar you bought.
Oh, it's a Gibson SG.
Yeah.
Standard. Autumn shade. I've wanted one for some time. I have a Fender Stratocaster. That's all single coils. So this is humbucking or double coil pickups.
Yeah.
And it's a 2018, so it was brand new. It's never been owned before, but since it was a 2018 model, what normally is a $1,900 guitar, I got for about $1,400. So
that's a good deal. If people know anything about instruments, especially the higher quality, that's a good price. Right. It's a gorgeous guitar, man.
Thank you.
It's pretty.
Well, we're going to get started here. Nobody wants to hear me talking about my guitars, probably, though I could talk about them all day long. Thank you for being on this Zoom Q&A, and thank you again, Fred, as I said at the end of your session. Thank you for reminding us how our reception of baptism and the Lord's Supper shape us for hospitality, and how hospitality itself is so essential for participation in the mission of God, and opens space for the reign of God, the kingdom of God to become manifest. That really stood out. We got a few more people coming in. I like, so in the your presentation, you list off 5 sort of practices that flow out of the table: mutual submission, thanksgiving, non-anxious presence, one anotherness, and forgiveness. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but those kind of follow, they're not just 5 things, but they're kind of a chronological order.
Yeah, I think you can't have one without the other. And now that, chicken or egg as to what, which one does what. But I
Sure.
do believe that to have either one of them, if you want to cultivate a life that reflects any of these, you have to have all of these. That's the way I would work it out in my head. And I think if we started really examining it on a practical level, I think we would conclude that that's the case.
Right. A lot of people listening might not be familiar with Miroslav Volf, but I know you mentioned him last night. You and I are both familiar with some of his writings. And in your talk, you kind of bring out something that I don't know if you got it from Volf, but I know Volf himself talks about this, what he calls this as so structure, that as we receive grace, we'll say, I mean, the Lord's table is a represent signifier of God's grace to us. As we receive the grace of God, so we must extend the grace of God, to others. And I thought you brought this out well, kind of the Thanksgiving, moving to the one anotherness. And you said, we are sent out from the table to our neighbor to be a witness of love. Want to expound anymore?
Yeah, no, I didn't get that from Volf, but that's interesting. It's been years since I read that book. He has an updated version that I'm trying to one day soon read through in that book. But I get that from Paul. I forget the name of the author, but the idea that grace is gift, but grace comes with responsibility. Dallas Willard once said that grace is opposed to earning, but not effort. And so I've come to believe that the work of grace isn't just to save us, it's also to make us more gracious. And that aligns itself with how sanctification works. If you want to use a biblical term, it's sanctification. It's Paul's language of we are being built into something. We're the process of spiritual maturity. And what's interesting about hospitality as a posture is that it breaks the cycle of reciprocity, but it also cultivates the cycle of reciprocity. As I am welcomed by Christ, I then welcome others. Welcome one another as you have been welcomed by Christ. I talked about that, I think, last night. And so I do think that the work of God's grace is to make us more gracious. The work of God's love is to make us more loving. The work of forgiveness is to make us more forgiving. I think that's why Jesus tied our own forgiveness to our willingness or unwillingness to forgive another. You remember that in the text where Jesus says, how can you expect to be forgiven by God if you won't forgive one another? And I think it's on a hyperbolic statement of God, of Jesus basically saying, God is utterly and completely, utterly holy. And yet he's willing to extend his love and forgiveness and life to you. How can then you ever think we could stand before the absolute glory of a holy, loving God and say, we were wrong to such a degree that we are incapable of forgiving another? And so I see a vertical and horizontal to the Christian life perpetually. And I feel like in the church, what falls from the heavens is supposed to fall not into our laps so we catch it and put it in our pockets. But I believe that what falls from heaven falls into our laps so that we can extend it to the world and bear witness to the reign of Christ at work in the world. So yeah, there's always a vertical horizontal in my view, which is why I think Jesus said, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Everything hangs on these two things.
Very good. You know, I think how, you know, sometimes people have observed how some of the most gracious people are recovered addicts,
Yes.
because they, you know, people who have been around addicts, whether it's drug addiction, alcoholism, in the throe of the addiction, they burnt bridges, hurt a lot of people along the way, and normally when they crash, come to the bottom, they become aware of how much harm they've done to themselves, to others, and yet they're finding forgiveness, they're finding the grace to get back up and walk again. And so, you know, if anyone's ever gone with somebody to an AA or NA meeting or Celebrate Recovery meeting, when someone comes in there and says, my name is Joe and I'm an alcoholic, or my name is Pam and I'm a drug addict. Hi, Pam. Good to have you here. This welcome embrace.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm good.
In this, thank you, John. In this, you know, mutual submission, Thanksgiving, non-anxious presence, you know, non-anxious presence, kind of describe that a little more.
Yeah.
Key to leadership.
Do what now?
It's key to leadership too.
It is. I mean, it is key to leadership, I think, for sure. And there have been books written on this, right? Like Slow to Nerve and all these other things, but that's not even the deal. Like, we are such, okay, so how to do this? Our society is built, in my opinion, on these systems of anxiety and scarcity. So like scarcity, we live in a society of scarcity where there's not enough oil to go around, there's not enough food to go around, there's not enough clothes to go around, there's not enough money to go around. This concept that there's not enough. And we're formed in this not enoughness. And that not enoughness leads us to this kind of anxiety of grasping and grasping and grasping, which then can push us into a position of coercion where whatever it takes, I've got to get what's mine. And if I don't get what's mine, then it's not going to exist for me to have later. I mean, Black Friday, Cyber Tuesday, Monday, all these different, like literally these rhythms in the American calendar, right? Like these, you know, the nature of a sale is get it now and get it cheap.
And this is why, like, you know, we always hear these stories on Black Friday. You have people beating each other up in the Walmart aisle just to, you know, who gets the next game.
Yeah. And so or like even in the pandemic, like the struggle for toilet paper. I mean, you saw people fighting over toilet paper. I mean, you know, and I'm, you know, I'm pro toilet paper, but you saw people fighting over this, right? And it's just like, yo, slow down. We have this anxiety about us that works against the ability to just be with God. So case in point, if you want to determine whether you have an anxious presence or non-anxious presence, then determine that you're going to be silent and present and still for 10 minutes. So in our worship liturgy, in our corporate gatherings, we have something called practicing the presence of God, where from 3 to 5 minutes, it is absolute, unadulterated silence and stillness.
People with ADHD, that's...
Brother, I have anxiety disorder, intrusive thoughts disorder, and all kind of Tourette's syndrome. Like I'm a walking poster child of someone who should get a grant for mental illness. I get the struggle of the brain and how the brain is wired and malformed due to all the different things. But that's my point. That's why I think we need these practices. We're either going to have practices that push us into a reliance of presence and settledness with God, especially for those of us who live with anxiety disorders and other things, or we're going to continue to be malformed by the practices that feed those things inside of our brains. And I would suggest that society is wired, is built on structures and systems that cultivate anxiety rather than cultivating a spirit of peace.
Right.
And I think the church as a countercultural community should do that. I'll never forget in my first ministry, I had an elder one time who was just determined that that we took too much time with the Lord's Supper. But yet it was the same elder who would say that's the central part of our gathering. So we had no problem giving 35 minutes to a sermon, 35 minutes to songs, but we had a real problem giving literally 8 minutes to the Lord's Supper. Yet the Lord's Supper was central to our gathering. To me, that isn't an indication of unhealthy doctrine or unhealthy theology. To me, that's an indication of an anxious presence.
Right.
Yeah, that's what we were made to practice as a chaplain
Word.
at the hospital. I think they would use words like, rather than do for, be with.
Yes, yes. That's why I said in my talk, there's a withness to the table that slows us down and causes us to look to our front, back, right, and left. And the only way to look to our front, back, right, and left after we've looked up is to slow down and be with.
Right. You know, the idea of non-anxiousness at the table, you know, here we are gathered around at the Lord's table. We get to be there. You know, God has a place for us there. The Lord has a place for us there, warts and all. And, you know, as John Mark Hicks pointed out, we're not just remembering his death, we're remembering Jesus, what Jesus has done, which his incarnation, his ministry, his life, yes, his death, but, you know, his resurrection and ascension and everything. And so we're being reminded of the very act, the very story that says God has overcome, and John Mark Hicks used that language, you know, in his talk, you know, that God has overcome death. And so we get to, we're reminded, we don't have to be fearful
Right.
anymore. Toilet paper might be scarce, but God's going to provide.
Right.
Thankfully, he'll provide with toilet paper too.
Yeah, I mean, that's just it. I think that's why Jesus said, do not worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear. Gentiles worry about such things. I don't think Jesus is giving a treatise on an anti-anxiety. I think what Jesus is doing is pastorally leading us to a realization that God feeds the birds of the air. And the truth of it is, God doesn't drop the worms in the nest. The birds have to fly out of the nest and find the worms, but they don't have to be anxious about whether or not the worms exist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an effort, but there's a being able to let go of the earning. And that to me is grace. We live in the grace of God.
Right. And that's what then results in Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And,
yes.
and results in us wanting others, you know, to enjoy this. So we become hospitable,
Yes.
to others, whether it be one another in the church, our neighbors down the road, maybe who play loud music till 3 a.m, whatever. Some of the people we don't want to be around, that we wouldn't on our own choose to be around, or even maybe the person in the church who is going to vote differently than I might vote. Or you're War Eagle, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so the person who would say go Crimson Tide.
Yeah, you're right. No, that's it, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the point that I was hoping to get, and I feel like it could be a conversation in itself. And Casey made the connection in the comments that there's a horizontal reality to the table. I mean, that's exactly right. And when we look at who Jesus instituted table with, who did he institute table with? An enemy. Not only did he wash the feet of an enemy, he instituted table with an enemy. Jesus didn't ask Judas to leave; Judas left. And I think that's a significant part of our faith, is to recognize that the table brings us together. The table becomes a sign and a symbol of the future reconciliation and preferred future of God. But we are too busy at times policing the table, mostly because we've cultivated inhospitable postures and forgotten that, as Paul would say, while we were enemies, Christ died for us. So I don't know, brother. I think Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper, whatever one wants to call it, I think all three words are biblical in meaning and purpose. Is really an act of humility.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only, and here's the thing, I think our language needs to change. We don't take the bread and the wine, we receive it.
Right.
It's not a pray and pass privatized experience. It is a communal experience. I remember when we first shifted the way we celebrate and practice Eucharist in our congregation, there were a handful of people who were really bothered by the fact that we took their private time with God away. And so we had to do some reteaching and help people understand this isn't a private time with God. It was never instituted as a private time with God. It was always instituted as a communal meal. As a matter of fact, when you go back to Exodus as the paradigm of Passover, it was a communal experience. I mean, it was a communal experience that pushed back the imagination to the past, to look toward the future, so that the present could be reordered and re-examined.
Mm-hmm.
It was never about me and Lord. It was always about me and we and the Lord.
Our language is important because language shapes our culture, our thinking. So, was somebody else speaking up? All right. If anyone else has any questions or comments, you can feel free to either type them in the chat box and we'll bring them up, or feel free to speak up. We want this to be interactive, as interactive as it needs to be.
What about when I looked at this session, I ran across Exodus 12 and 26, when the Lord told the Israelites what to do to prepare for the Passover. And he said, you shall observe the thing for an ordinance of thee and thy sons forever. And he said, and it shall come to pass when your children shall say, why are you doing this? It shall come to pass when your children shall say, why are you doing this service? And he told them just to repeat what God did for them. It was simple as that, repeat what God did for them, that he would pass over the houses of the children of Israel as he would smite those who were Egyptians. What God did in the life of Jesus is forever. And I saw Casey's kid, a young person there, and to just tell them, why are we having the Lord's Supper? It's as simply as to say, we're doing this because this, and you explain what God did through Jesus Christ for us. It was just a simple answer he gave them. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say it's a simple answer, but it's a lengthy practice and embodiment of that answer. So if you think about the Exodus and the Passover meal, it wasn't that they just got together, warmed up some lamb and put out some dip. There were bitter herbs, there were good herbs. It was a practiced experience, and frankly was a practice experience that took preparation, which is why Passover was a week and not just a day. And so it was a lengthy experience of a simple answer. So the words may be simple, but the practice was involved. So when you look at the practice of the Exodus, if you look at the practice of the Passover, it was a rehearsal of the entire Exodus experience. That's why they had bitter herbs. The bitter herbs were there to remind them that this came at a cost. This came at a price. So I'm with you, Weldon, brother. It was a simple answer, but it was a long and extended way of rehearsing that answer. I think likewise the same as with the Lord's Supper, by the way. When we come to the table, we don't just remember the death, we remember what makes the death eternal changing, and it was the life of Jesus. So when we come to the table, we also remember the life of Christ. And when we come to the table and we remember the death of Christ, we then look toward the future that Christ offers us. So I don't want the word simple or simplicity to make us think that it's just a 2-minute experience. It can be, and I would suggest ought to be, a moment where we stop and where we just remember all that we have. So in the early church tradition, and if, I wish John Mark were here because he could talk about this far better than I could. That's why the agape meal would almost always precede the Eucharist, which is what we see happening in 1 Corinthians 11. The agape meal was meant to be a doorway into Eucharist, into the Lord's Supper, where we move from having just a meal together where the rich provide for the poor, because that's what the agape meals would do, is people who didn't have food would have food because the food would be shared by those who had it. Very Acts 2, very Acts 4. And then out of that would flow a time of remembering why we just did what we did. We did what we just did because Christ did this for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the challenge in that is in our restoration churches, the focus has often been on just, are we doing this right according to the prescribed way? And then as we're influenced by Western culture, which is highly individual, becomes just about this vertical relationship, my God and I, and whether we got it, right. And, there's been all, kinds of one cup, or can we have multiple cups? Does it have to be unleavened bread, or, and all these and then we miss this. And, that's one of the challenges I see. Certainly nobody I don't think the New Art Church is still locked in that legalism issue. I know Williamsburg Christian isn't, but that's historically been one of the challenges. And then just getting used to the idea of, hey, maybe we need to give more space for the Lord's Supper.
Well, and if you ever, one of the first things I ever learned from John Mark Hicks was when he had published many years ago and pointed me to first century and second century church fathers like Tertullian and Justin Martyr, who described what the Lord's Supper looked like. Well, who described what the worship assembly looked like for the early church, which is what our heritage, Restoration heritage, claims to have connection to. And the way they celebrated the Lord's Supper was far more involved than the way we do. I think it was either Tertullian or Martyr, and you'd have to look it up. I could send it to you if you wanted me to. Said that even before the table, the elders would stand up before the congregation, and any brothers and sisters who were caught by the congregation, anybody in the congregation for committing any kind of like sinful acts, were required to go meet with the elders for a while before they could receive the bread and the wine. I mean, could you imagine if we did that in our gatherings today? We're getting ready for the table and Rex stands up and say, hey, everybody, I need to inform you on what I saw Casey do this week. And then now Casey has to go meet with the elders and get right with the Lord because he's a confessed Christian before he can come to the table. I mean, that again, there may be a simplicity and an ordinariness in what we do, but it doesn't mean there's not a divine intent and an involvement of the spirit of what we're doing. I feel like so many times our tradition got caught up in the letter of what was happening that we missed the spirit of what was happening.
Right.
Well, and that was a great question. You opened up a really good discourse. I appreciate you throwing that out there, brother.
So I'll ask this, Fred. So do you have some things you're doing in the time of communion to practice the horizontal? Are there horizontal practices? You know, like at Gulf Coast, you know, it was nice when you could walk to the tables and you kind of talk to people along the way. You'd interact a little bit. Our elder in Oxford would almost raise his little glass and say, you know, until he comes, you know. So I've seen a few little things, but in the local context, it seems really hard to figure out how to practice the horizontal aspects of the table.
Yeah. Yeah. So we shifted where the Lord's Supper falls. The Lord's Supper is actually the invitation from the sermon every week. Because I mean, we're talking to the gathered people of God. So out of the word flows the table. And so the invitation to WCC family is all messages land at the table. And so then Casey, people come to the table. So we literally line up and we sing and we celebrate and there's laughter and hugs. Y'all, true story. I've seen families reconcile ongoing fights at the table. I've seen families within the congregation have to reconcile before they come to the table because they recognize coming out of message, coming out of word, standing side by side, that they have to get it right as they come to the table. What we did in our gathered time in a pre-COVID world is we would usually invite anyone from the church to stand at the table as people came to the table. So I'll give you an example. One of the young men at the group home that we took in, his dad was dying. His name is Peter, and he is a 37-year-old brother who lives with Down syndrome and other things going on in his life and in his physical body. And he always sits with me on Sundays, always sits at the front with me, always puts his arm around me as we sing to God and with one another. And one Sunday, I'll never forget, his dad was dying and he had no family who was going to care for him. And he was afraid he was going to be alone and be abandoned. And we had just baptized him into Christ a year before that. And so I decided on a whim, and I have very gracious elders, for him to stand with me at the table. And I wanted him to stand with me at the table because I wanted him to see the line of people that were coming to the table. And every time someone would come to him, I would whisper in his ear, "That's your brother. That's your sister. That's your brother. That's your sister. We're your family." And that marked something in me and in our leadership. And we decided at that moment, every week we wanted different people in the congregation to stand at the table so they could see the family of God coming to the Christ who's brought us together, so that they could see the differences of people who come. And so it changed how we practice the table entirely. And coming out of the word makes that practice, I think, even more powerful for us.
Man, I like that description, how you described that. Thank you.
No, it's my joy. I tell you, Peter, I mean, it was such a whim. But God I felt like the Spirit was like, "Hey, show him who his family is."
Right.
Powerful, changed me, man. That moment, that Sunday was one of those Kairos moments for me.
Any other comments, questions? All right. Fred, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for allowing me to be with you. It's been my joy, been my pleasure. And if anybody ever wants to engage anything I've said and you want to shoot me an email or what have you, please feel free to do that.
Yeah. Go down there, go to the Dog Street Pub or whatever it is.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah, if anyone's ever in Williamsburg, look us up. You have a place with us.
Well, thank you. I'm going to close this Zoom meeting out, and in 4 minutes, we'll be back on for our closing segments of the Imagine Conference. See you all.
Thanks,
in-
Fred.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.